Jim, thank you so much for talking to me. Primarily, obviously, I want to talk about biohistory. And I have to say, I really do think it is one of the most fascinating theories, not just about history, but about how we should structure our society, about how we should live our lives as individuals. It's so fundamentally important to everything. If it's true, and I have to say you've argued it very well, if it's true, it's going to change everything, I think, many fields of study. How do you feel about the theory?
Well, it is quite revolutionary. There's no question about that. It overturns every assumption about society. I mean, you look at any news report, you look at what people are talking about, economics, politics, to do with population, to do with a range of things. To look at virtually every history book that had been written, you'd have to rewrite. Why do wars take place? Why do economies collapse, or why do they boom? Why did the Industrial Revolution take place? It's a completely different reason for everything. Actually, the main point is what you said before, is what if it's true? If it's true. The really striking thing about biohistory is that it is a theory, but it's actually quite easily testable. In every chapter of the book, I actually put forward a test that can be done to show whether it's actually correct or not. And that's the essence of a scientific theory. And it's very different from any other theory of history, because you have, just as an example, you have a theory of history that says, well, the Second World War took place because Hitler was a mean guy, and because of the Great Depression and because of Versailles. Now, the trouble with that is you can't repeat that. But my theory actually says the Second World War took place because basically, well, one of the main reasons was because women who had young children at the end of the First World War experienced a high level of anxiety. And therefore, the children who grew up were more aggressive, and when they reached their early 20s, they became more aggressive. And that is a theory that you can test by looking at societies where children grew up. Like, for example, you couldn't do it for the First World War because they're mostly dead, but look at people who were born in 1944, 1945, or in China in 1948, 1949, and they should have a distinct epigenetic signature which is associated with aggression in animals and very different from the generation from the cohort that was born earlier or later.
Yes, that's right. And that is really what's so important about it. I mean, Karl Marx, of course, tried to create a scientific theory of history, frustratingly unsuccessfully, I would add. But what you have done is you haven't attempted to change the historical method or put any opinion or ideology into the historical method. You've left that as it is. We have to try and determine what's the most reasonable thing that happened in the past, given the evidence. But nevertheless, you're looking at biology. You're looking at how, over time and in cycles, our hormonal or even pheromonal levels can change, and how things can alter, and how it's, like you say, a testable cycle that these things will change over time, and then applying that to what we can see happened in the past, you get a very successful model of analysing the patterns throughout history when wars occur, when scientific or philosophical breakthroughs occur. And from what you've demonstrated in biohistory, it does seem to fit. But before we get ahead of ourselves, I'd just like to talk about C, V, and S, and perhaps talk a little bit about G as well. So if you, please, could just define what is C, what's V, and where does S come into that?
Okay, let's start with C, and let's start with the biology, because I like to do with biology. C is basically, it's a physiological system that adapts animals to food shortage. When an animal is short of food, I'm not talking about starving, but just chronically short of food, their behavior changes. For example, they tend to spend a lot more time looking for food even when they're not hungry, which is a human analogy to work. They tend to form smaller groups at the extreme monogamous nuclear families. They're less active sexually. They spend a lot of effort and time caring for their offspring. They delay mating. At the extreme, if you have a territory, they won't mate until they've got an exclusive territory. Now, in human societies, the same kinds of behavior are found in civilized societies, particularly. So, for example, control of children, which is a sort of an equivalent, monogamous nuclear families, restriction of sexual activity, delayed breeding. People don't have sex early, and they delay marriage till they're quite late. And if, for example, you look at European history, what you'll see over the 1,000 years or so up to about 1850, there's this extreme change in all these family behaviors. People become more monogamous, restrict sexual activity, control their children much, much more tightly, start controlling them earlier, even in infancy. And at the same time this happens, you get a series of changes to economic changes. People become more economically productive, more hardworking, more creative. They also have more impersonal attitudes, so they're more likely to be loyal to their constitutions and laws. So that's basically C. It's a biologically based change in temperament, which in humans is associated particularly with very advanced economies and large states. It's got to do with a number of things. It's one of the effects that food restriction has is to reduce testosterone, and there's a sort of a carry-on effect in that. It also matters a great deal. It happens early in life, so C can be kind of locked in various ways. So that's C.
Yes.
V. Biologically speaking, V is a response to intermittent stresses. For example, baboons have very, very high C because they live in a very dangerous environment, lots of predators, famine, occasional famines, very, very severe stresses. Not all the time, but occasionally you get these extreme stresses. And the effect of that in the animal society is that they become very, very aggressive. They're very good at forming tight bonds within a group. They're very cohesive. Like baboons will gang up together, and they will if they take out a leopard, for example, they're very, very effective as a group. So it's very human terms, very warlike societies.
Yes.
They also breed very, very fast. They look after their infants very well, and then they kick them out and they breed again. They're also very patriarchal. These are all characteristics that help an animal to cope with a dangerous environment. It means they can migrate very easily. They can fight off outsiders. Now, in humans, that's associated with warlike. This is why throughout history, warlike barbarians from the steppes and from the desert and from the mountains constantly come down into the plains, into the fertile plains, because the harsh conditions, the occasional famines, give them very, very high V.
And S as well.
Okay.
If it's not too soon to go into it.
No. S is somewhat more difficult. The C and V are epigenetic. In other words, there's no change to the genes that make it happen. Certain animals, for example, gibbons, have, genetically speaking, very high C. Baboons, for example, seem to be genetically set for high V. I don't think that humans are particularly oriented one way or the other, whether we're more high or low Z. We're genetically very similar in that respect. But what actually happens is that there's been a genetic change in many parts of the world, in much of the human species, that influences the age at which control starts. And it seems to be to do with how indulgent people feel towards infants.
Yes.
So, for example, traditional Western societies, we're very tolerant of letting infants cry. And we start, at least traditionally, control of children very early. Like in my first marriage, we started training our children before the age of 1, even just teaching them not to touch the Chinese checkers. But that's a typical European pattern, and to some extent Japanese are like that too. In other societies like in China, India, and the Middle East, they tend to be very, very indulgent of infants, quite horrified at the idea. So my current wife's Chinese, for example, she just cannot comprehend the idea of training an infant. She says he doesn't understand. Now, at the age of, say, 4, 5, 6, they start to bring on the control, particularly after about age 6. But there's this tendency to indulge infants. Now, what actually seems to happen is this. Early societies, early man was much like us. I call it low S, low stability. There's reasons for that. And that means that we control children very early in life. Now, this has a number of characteristics. One thing is that we tend to be very highly creative, more creative, better at mechanical skills, and we also tend to form nation states. We have very strong loyalties to local areas. Now that makes
which is a higher C.
Yes, it does help to create very high C. When you start control of infants very early, you get a highest level of C. So you have these characteristics. So this makes a particularly brilliant civilization, like the ancient civilizations of India and China, and also, say, classical Greece, were extremely creative. They were brilliant in terms of philosophy, very original. They all had these nation states, or in the stage of Greece, city-states, and they had this incredible economic skills, marketing skills, and so forth. So they had these advanced technological civilizations. Now, what happened, particularly in the case of India and China, and also to some extent the Sumerians in Mesopotamia, is that they collapsed. These civilizations collapsed into a very prolonged dark age. And what seems to happen is that when you have very high C in this form that starts in early childhood, the societies are creative, they're wealthy, but they're also unstable. They unite into these cosmopolitan empires, and then they collapse into centuries of barbarism. And what actually happens is this creative personality basically undermines C and V. Because one thing I should have mentioned before is that civilizations actually artificially raise the level of C and V, particularly C, by cultural systems like religion, which cause people to restrict, control their children, to control their sexual activity, to not to engage in adultery, those kind of things. It artificially raises the level of C. So as civilizations develop in the early stages, first to farming, it requires higher C so they can work hard, and then to form urban civilization, the level of C is raised, and that's what makes them successful. But if it's this, you might call more primitive form of C, which involves control of infants, it's a brilliant civilization, it's unstable. Now, part of that collapse, because this, what we call low S genetic thing makes them unstable, people with that tend to have less children. And those who have a different variant where they indulge infants tend to have more children. So there's a genetic change during the process of collapse and recovery that favors indulgence of infants. So the societies that come out of these collapses are what we call high S, and S stands for stability. So there's a genetic change that takes place during the collapse that causes them to be less creative but far more stable. And then they form these cosmopolitan empires. And that is the history of China and India and the Middle East after these initial collapses.
So just to recap and summarize, C results in prosperity effectively. If you have a society whereby the people are more creative, and man being a rational animal, we develop philosophies, we develop cultural technology, so things like religion, practices, which change us. They actually change our physiology so that we are more hardworking. We're prepared to sacrifice present pleasures for future success, even for our family in the future, or society at large even. We're able to have allegiance to more abstract ideas, so not just a tribal leader or a king or anything like that, but even just laws, ideas, things that we can determine rationally in our minds. And what that does is it creates a prosperous society. But as you pointed out in your book, that prosperity actually can then end up killing the society. And this is how you end up with a cycle where you'll have higher C, but then things can come around. You can end up with a high V society, and things can change. And as you've shown, that does actually happen throughout history. Is that right? Have I got that right in my mind?
Yeah, basically, except that's essentially correct. The thing is, V itself is one of the things that drives the rise in C. So when you get these people with very high V, they come in and combined with a level of stress, which V people tend to be more stressed because they're very aggressive. that actually raises the level of C, because cortisol, the stress hormone cortisol, is one of the things that increases C. So it's kind of like V becomes high, that together with these cultural forms, these religions, it raises the level of C. And what that high level of C does, particularly when you apply it to infants, is it actually tends to collapse the V. It destroys the V. So the V drops first and then the C. And you can see that in our own civilization, the level of V was highest for us about the 16th century. Very aggressive, very patriarchal, very brutal too, very cruel. And then for hundreds of years that dropped, that fell. And we became more humane, and there was less capital punishment and less torture, and women became in a stronger position. Yeah. But C kept on rising from the 19th century.
Yeah, you point out that the English were actually at once known throughout Europe for being very emotional even.
Yes, exactly.
Very hasty. But within a few hundred years, they were known as being very cold and stiff upper-lipped. Anyway, sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. And that's the peak of C in the 19th century. And interesting, that's also the latest age of puberty too, the age of puberty. People think that the age of puberty fell because better food. But the interesting thing is the age of puberty was much later in the 19th century than it was in the famine-ridden 13th century, for example. So you get this rise in C, but all the time the level of V's been dropping. And then what happens, say, in the late 90s, early 20th century, the level of V drops very, very fast. And eventually that causes the level of C to start falling. And since about the 1960s, of course, it's fallen very, very fast since the sexual revolution. And that's now starting to have an effect because we're starting to lose the prosperity that's the result of high C.
We also spoke about S there. Low S, you've described as being unstable. And yet, in my mind, when I think of low S, I'm thinking of civilizations that would have a higher C. They're groups who would be more controlling, not necessarily punishing, just controlling and providing guidelines for infants, even, like you said, even under one, not having that tendency to view them as being incapable of any moral judgment, but being very controlling even with their infants, and developing that higher C society. But when I think of S, in my mind, I've tended to confuse it with subordination. Because when I think of high S, I think of those civilizations, like you've said, where people are more inclined to be a small cog in a very large empire, perhaps tyrannical government. But when I think of a lower S, I think of, as you said, the ancient Greeks. And, well, they have these little petri dish city-states, and a lot of those were experiments in liberty. And the Romans as well, to an extent, were also low S as well. And they also endeavoured to, whether more or less successfully, creating a society where liberties of free men would be protected. So when I think of S, I tend to think of subordination. Is that fair of me to be thinking that way, or am I wrong to do so?
It's not so much S itself, it's the effect it has in conjunction with other things. For example, if you look at somewhere like, that's a relatively high S society, they're Chinese. Jews tend to be relatively high S, for example. It's not, and they can be obviously very democratic and very humane. It's more the way that S interacts with V. S just means that a society, the level of C doesn't collapse as fast. They tend to be more conservative. I mean, as an example, you take North and South Italy. And South Italy, when North Italy was becoming very prosperous, because it's a lower S society, because a lot of Germans came in after the collapse of the Roman Empire. So it's low S, that it became more and more prosperous. Well, Sicily and southern Italy, which is largely much fewer Germans settled, has much higher S. They tended to be more conservative. So it's more to do with conservative behaviour. I mean, whether you have a tyrannical, brutal sort of force, that depends on things like, for example, how much punishment you get in late childhood. Yes. When you punish children very severely in late childhood, you get a form of V which is makes people very open to powerful authority. They just tend to obey the most powerful rulers around.
Yes.
And that's why they form cosmopolitan empires. In a high C society with low S, there's a very strong loyalty to the nation, to the people of common language and so forth. You say, I don't care. It's like, for example, when the Spaniards invaded or tried to take over the Netherlands, or they tried to crush the Dutch. I mean, the Dutch were a fraction of their population, but they fought bitterly for decades to defend themselves. They said, we want to be ruled by ourselves, by people similar to ourselves.
Yes.
They were prepared to go to extraordinary lengths to achieve this. Or when Napoleon's soldiers invaded Spain, the Spaniards rose in revolt. They just don't want to be ruled by somebody different. Whereas in these higher societies, like in China and India, they just tend to accept they don't have the same powerful loyalty towards ethnic groups, towards people who are similar to them. They just say, well, they're the most powerful force, let's obey them. Now, the corollary of that, of course, is that in a place like Iraq, we tend to take the view that people reflect the government. So if you've got a tyrannical government, you get rid of the inevitably have peace and democracy. Now, biohistory takes a different view. It says government reflects the people. If you've got a tyrannical, brutal government, it's because that is the only kind of government these people who tend to punish in late childhood are likely to accept.
Yes.
So when you get rid of it according to biohistory, you don't get peace and democracy, you get anarchy, you get war. And that's what happened with the Arab Spring, right across the Arab world. You get rid of these brutal regimes, which to us are very unpleasant. But you either get a new autocracy, as in Egypt, or you get anarchy. And when we were about to invade Iraq, I got so upset about it. I had a big argument with my eldest son about it. I said, this is a terrible idea. You're not going to have democracy. You're not going to have peace. No. If you get rid of a brutal dictator, unless you're prepared to be as brutal, which we aren't,
yes,
you're going to get anarchy. And it's exactly what happens. I was absolutely furious because I was so upset. But that's the stupid mistakes we make because we don't understand how society works. We think people reflect governments. It's the other way around.
Yeah, that's a very interesting thought. You mentioned Napoleon just now. I just wanted to add that Napoleon, when he was in the Middle East, he learned very quickly. He said, if I'm going to last here, if people are not going to consider me effeminate, I have to be brutal with the people. And of course, we look back at Napoleon's most monstrous time as being the time he was in the Middle East and the things he would do to try and control the populace there. To us at the moment, we see that as being horrific and monstrous, and it's precisely because of what you've said. But really, the government is a reflection of what the people want. In a sense, we're getting what we deserve. Is it fair to say that?
Exactly right. And that's why our governments are in such trouble. All across the world, you've got governments that are going deeper into debt because they can't win people's support for sensible policies anymore. You get something like Donald Trump in the US. He's an alarming figure. He really is. This is a guy who wants to go into the Middle East and grab the oil fields and seize control and get the oil for the Americans. He wants to build a huge wall against Mexico and make the Mexicans pay for it. I mean, he's a nutter. But people like him because he's just not politics as normal. So there's growing cynicism about the political systems and about democracy. It's the same thing that happened in the late Republic when people started to following charismatic warlords like Sulla and Marius and Julius Caesar. Yes. And in the end, that's the end of democracy. Because when you stop supporting the rule of law, sensible, moderate policies, and go for any charismatic figures who says, yes, I'll lead you to the promised land, you're in trouble.
And before we move on to discussing the course of Western civilization, past, present, and then future, of course, just to clarify, S could be considered a sense of conservatism in the society, but it would have to be combined with a high V for there to be a more tyrannical form of government. Is that correct?
Yes. Well, you can have, if you have a high V associated with punishment of children, you're going to get a fairly brutal regime anyway. I mean, Henry VIII is a good example. He was an absolute animal. If you read the stuff he did and the cruelty and the brutality, including to his own wives, all his ministers he butchered. I mean, he was just a monster of a man. But people accept it. The point of it is that a high-S society, which indulges infants, it finds it easier to do that. It's more natural to have that kind of society and to have it stable.
But in what we would typically call the beginnings of Western civilization. So if I could, well, even arguably go back to the Indo-Europeans, Ricardo Duchenne, who I will be talking with hopefully next week, and whom I believe was of some help to you in the development of the book Biohistory. he's argued that when we're looking at Western history, we really need to look back to the Indo-Europeans coming into Europe and how they altered the culture there. If we look back to even before the Greeks, which is typically where people start when they're looking at Western civilization, what was it that enabled there to be a low S society there, do you believe?
And low S is the normal ancestral human form. Europeans are low S, Northern Europeans and particularly Africans would be low S. Anybody who hasn't gone through a civilization collapse will tend to be low S. Now, there's variations in that. Germans, for example, people from originally from Scandinavia tended to be extremely low S. It may be that Celtic people, like those who, like in Ireland, are a little bit less so. It's the ancestral conditions, but Germans are anybody of Germanic descent seems to have the lowest level of S, which is why you see where Germanic settlers, where Germans settled after the end of the Roman Empire, is the area where you have industrialization taking off, 1,500 years later.
Yes. I'm wondering why it was that after the collapse of the Mycenaean kingdom, and there was the Dark Ages of Greece that followed, why do they not have a higher S? Because they appear to be quite low S. Is that correct in my thinking? They appear to be quite high C in order to be able to then produce the miracle of Greece, as it's called, with the philosophy and beginnings of science and art, poetry, all the rest of it.
Yeah, it's because the collapse of Mycenaean civilization just wasn't that dramatic. It's only the collapse happens most dramatically when sea rises to very, very high levels, as it did in say, Rome and Greece. The Mycenaean civilization is a lower level of sea. It's a more primitive civilization, so when it collapsed, it wasn't an extreme. I mean, similar things happened, for example, in India, where you get the early Indus Valley civilization, or in China, the Shang. You get earlier civilizations arising, but if they're not very high S, the collapse isn't as extreme, and you don't get this tendency for S to grow. See, societies evolve more powerful cultures with time, and that's what allows C to arise to a higher level. Mycenae, they might have received a level of, they might have achieved a C level of, say, 3. The ancient Greeks might have, in the classical age, might have gone to, say, 6. Of course, Europeans in the 9th century might have been 10 by comparison.
Yeah.
So the higher the level of C that's achieved in these low S civilizations, the more thorough the collapse and the stronger the tendency for the level of S to rise because of genetic selection.
But then, of course, C and V do go through their cycles. And so as we continue through European history, we eventually come to the stage where Rome collapsed, the Goths, and the Vandals and the Saxons began moving throughout Europe. Would you argue then that this is why those southern European countries now have a higher level of S, because a society which has been through a more dramatic collapse of civilization, and it's hard to think of a more dramatic collapse of civilization than the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, that this is why southern European countries have a higher level of S, and northern European countries which didn't really go through that. And so this is why northern European countries tend to still have that lower S, that higher industrious level that we see particularly with the Germans. I mean, they're notorious for it, really, aren't they?
Yeah, it's the level of collapse was probably pretty similar throughout, but Northern Europe had a lot more Germans coming in. Like, for example, when Justinian's armies under Belisarius took over Italy in the 6th century, they reconquered it briefly. They found virtually no German garrisons south of about Naples. There just were hardly any Germans in the south, whereas in the north, the Germans settled very strongly. That's why it's called Lombardy, and the Goths and people like that. And the same thing in France. You find there's a lot of Germans come in. So the big difference between the collapse of the Roman Empire and of China is that China became an India too. They became high-S societies because there weren't that many barbarians. Because in both of those civilizations, the neighboring peoples tend to be pastoralists. They tend to be low level of population, like the nomads. So there weren't that many of them. Now, in the case of Europe, you've had this huge population, relatively speaking, of Germans. There were lots and lots and lots of Germans. And they actually invaded and took over. So in Britain, for example, if you look at Y chromosome, evidence, the native Britons were virtually wiped out because Celtic Y chromosomes stop at the border of Wales. So there's virtually no male lines descended. So that indicates that there was a tremendous genetic change in Britain. Whereas in Sicily, for example, completely the opposite. There was very, very little influence from the Germans. So Britain is relatively low S still, and Sicily very high S. And you look at, say, France and northern France, the industrial areas, has probably had more Germans coming because they were closer to the frontier. Southern France, probably somewhat less. The level of collapse may have had a part in this. I mean, Italy was probably very, very strongly affected because it was decadent for centuries. It really had a lot of problems. That's why their population was dropping very, very early. It may have been that places like Gaul weren't quite as affected, but in a sense, it's mainly the sheer number of barbarians coming in that makes the difference. And in Northern Europe, there were a lot. In Southern Europe, much less. And in India and China, also very much less.
But then today, as again, you've argued so well in your book, we could be experiencing, or, well, rather we will experience, a collapse, perhaps on the same scale as the collapse of Rome, which could very well have serious effects on even the physiology and the temperament of people in the West at large. So
well, it's already happening. It's already happening. There's so many signs of it. You've got economic stagnation throughout the Western world. Japan, America's growing a bit, but most of Europe is stagnant. Our birth rates are below replacement level. Increasing cynicism about politics. There are signs of things like disease becoming more prevalent. We're losing our resistance to infectious disease, levels of testosterone dropping. There's a whole series of signs going on. And what biohistory says is this is going to get much, much, much worse, and very rapidly so over coming decades, unless we act to stop it, which my research suggests could be possible if you've understood it. But in actual fact, you're not going to get a decline like the end of the Roman Empire, because the difference in our world is we've got these very large populations of this very advanced culture, which is in the Muslim Middle East. And they're people who are very resistant to the collapse of V and C. So as they come in, they actually preserve their own culture to a large extent, and more and more of them come in. You can see it happening in Europe right now, where you've got hundreds of thousands of people coming from North Africa and from the Middle East and places like Syria. Now, eventually what's going to happen is that the whole of Europe will just gradually change over to something a bit more like modern Syria, a very conservative, fundamentalist Islamic type society. So there won't be extreme collapse because there's enough of them to stop that happening, which is probably a relatively good thing, because what happened in the West after the fall of Rome was horrifying. It was just dreadful. The population dropped to a fraction of its former level. The misery, the disease, it was just appalling. I think to be something more like the Middle East would be preferable. But in my own view, I would rather see us work out a way to try and save our own civilization, because I think it's got a lot of value.
If I could just run past you what my thoughts are, what I've taken away from the book. The cultural technology we had, Christianity, so fundamental in European culture, all at once enabled us to preserve some of the philosophical ideas that drove on this higher degree of rationality that has been so typical of the West. But also it brought in more cultural practices that helped to raise C, because as you've argued, religion is a way of tricking the body into believing that the circumstances are such that it needs to be more C promoting, it needs to get into that mode. And so by the time we reach Victorian England, which you say is really the pinnacle, or the sterling example really of high C, we have a civilization that one could argue is up there with the miracle of Greece or the glories of Rome, because it was in Victorian society, of course. We had tremendous scientific advancement, tremendous advance in philosophical thought, wherever you care to look. But following on from that, as the cycle continued, C dropped, and there were still a high level of V, was there? So there was still higher stress and high testosterone as well, of course, which led to, as you would argue, things like the world wars, the economic collapses, and then the acceptance of less liberal forms of government. So in America, they had the New Deal. In Russia, although their government was already fairly dictatorial, they accepted the brutalities of Stalinism. And of course, we needn't even mention Germany accepting a much more dictatorial form of government. Is that correct in my thinking?
Yeah, except V tends to drop before C. V's been dropping since the 16th century in Europe, and it's that's when after C reaches a peak, it's the fall of V together with wealth that actually causes C to be dropping. What happened with the Stalinist terror or the Great Depression is actually it's a short-term rise in stress as a result of prosperity, strangely enough. In a sense, what seems to happen is that in times of prosperity, relativist prosperity, people become more extroverted. They become more look for stimulus, which causes the level of stress in society to rise, and you get this surge of stress taking place. And then that eventually causes C to start to rise, or at least to fall to moderate, and then that becomes more conservative, which is why you get the baby booms happening after the Depression. But the world wars themselves had a number of reasons why they happened. One of them is that, and this is the peculiarity that we get from rat studies, if you limit food in adult rats, you reduce testosterone. That's a sign of a C-promoting effect. However, if you limit food for very young rats, like through their mothers, for example, or even the previous generation, that tends to increase testosterone. So the maximum level of testosterone happens when you've got a restricted, that's high C early life, and a lower C later life. For example, when the level of C is dropping. And that's what actually happened from the late 19th century. The level of C started to drop. So you get this massive surge of testosterone, which was expressed in the First and Second World War. And the other thing that happened too, and this gets into a different area, what I've realized is that much of human behavior can be explained by the fact that humans actually have cycles like lemmings. And you know, lemmings have this 3 to 4 year cycle where they go through this great surge of population growth. They become very aggressive. They lose their fear. They breed very fast and they migrate a long way. Well, that's actually a surge of V that happens periodically. Muskrats do it about every 10 years, say, on varying hairs. So they're about 10 generation cycles. Well, if you have a look at human societies, you find the same thing happening in human societies. You get roughly this 300-year cycle where you get surges of population growth. Say, for example, in England around the 12th, 13th centuries, around the 16th century, and the 19th century, with periods of negative growth or no growth in between. That's what's called a lemming cycle. As lemmings become more aggressive as they reach their peak of population, so do human beings. So you get this surge of aggression taking place as we pass our peak of population. And you can look at this very clearly because you can look at different societies in Europe. They reach their peaks of population growth at different times. Like the first were the French, late 18th century, end of the 18th century.
Yes.
Immediately afterwards, you get the Napoleonic Wars, the Revolution. The British, 1870s, then you get this surge of imperialism to cover of Africa, you get the Boer War. The Germans and the Russians and the Austrians, 1890s. As those children born at that peak grow up, they launch into the First World War. The Italians, it's about 1916. So then you get the invasion of Abyssinia, 1936. And the Japanese, this is the most neatest point of all, you get the Pacific War. So as each country reaches this lemming cycle peak, this wave of aggression goes through the society and they launch these dreadful wars.
It's fascinating, if a little terrifying.
Well, it is too. And the other thing too, I might say, is that there's also an echo effect, because one of the things that drives V is having a very high level of anxiety in infancy. Women in wartime tend to experience a lot of anxiety. So the children born towards the end of major wars tend to be extremely aggressive. It's when they grow up, they're born towards the end of the war, the last 2 years of the war, they grow up in times of peace, they have this super high level of V. So the children who grew up, who were born at the end of the First World War, they came to maturity in the late 1930s, so you get the Second World War. The children who were born in 1940-45, when they came of age, they formed the student radicals and the violence of the late 1960s, 1968. In China, the children who were born at the end of the Civil War, as they became teenagers, they were the shock troops of the Cultural Revolution. You get this dreadful violence that took place in China. And you can even see another echo too. The children who were born towards the end of the Cultural Revolution, as they grow up, they were the Tiananmen Square protesters. They also became more aggressive. So there's a kind of an echo effect. But it's lemming cycles and then the echoes of previous wars. And one of the reasons I've noticed this is because it's a very common pattern in Chinese history in particular. You often get, when Chinese dynasties are founded, you often get a double start. You get one regime takes over, a generation later, there's a massive series of revolts, and another regime takes over. The Qin and the Han, the Sui, the Tang, happened with the Ming, happened with the Qing. It's a repeated pattern of these major wars finishing, and then about a generation later, 25 years later, you get this series of rebellions and more wars.
So C falling faster than V sounds like a really bad piece of news, Jim. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, C falling is not a good idea for any society. You get a surge of testosterone, which is very violent and unpleasant, and people like the Nazis are a classic example of high testosterone individuals, brutal and mean in the extreme.
Are we experiencing something like this now in the West? Perhaps not as significant as the rise of Nazism yet, but are we experiencing a decline of C that's a bit too fast?
Well, there's no such thing as a good decline of C. The loss of C means loss of wealth, loss of democracy, loss of everything, loss of science, loss of everything. We don't want declining C. That no society we could imagine would be good if it doesn't have a reasonably high level of C. Actually, in fact, we're a very low V society. Our level of V is even lower. It's extremely low. That's why people don't fight wars anymore. That's a great thing. I mean, in a lot of ways, it's a very nice place to be. If you can have relatively high C but very low V, that's actually the most creative time. In actual fact, there was a time in the West when we had almost the best balance, where we had the relatively high C still, but much lower V, and that's around about the 1970s. Well, that's the time when you get the greatest level of prosperity. The economic growth was tremendous. You get these fairly humane societies. They're very equal. The level of inequality was very low at that time. That's almost the ideal. And in fact, one of the reasons that the Greeks were incredibly creative is because they had very high C for the time, but they also had a low level of this form of V that's to do with punishment in late childhood. That's why they formed city-states, because they didn't accept brutal authority. It's also why they were creative. So your perfect society would be one with relatively high C, but relatively low V. And that's what makes it most creative and successful. Perhaps not as aggressive, but as long as V isn't so low you can't defend yourself, which is a big issue, and that's why societies, in a sense, get overrun by barbarians, because they can no longer fight.
Do you think that's our problem now?
Well, we've got to the stage, yes, where we're losing ground. I mean, C is dropping and V is so low. This is the reason why our populations can't be replaced and why we accept these large numbers of immigrants. I mean, immigration is great. I mean, we've done very well in Australia about our immigration policy, but you have a large number of people from very conservative cultures arriving all at once with different customs. Eventually, they're not going to be assimilated. They're just going to take over, in culturally speaking, because our own culture, our own people are becoming less capable with time.
Not just saying as an Englishman, but as a father, I see on the news and I see all around me an increase in immigration, and I realise that the people coming from these other cultures have a fundamentally different temperament to the one we have. And obviously, reading biohistory, I have this desire then to try and preserve as high a C temperament within the society my children are going to grow up in, as possible, simply because I believe, I understand that that is what is going to be better for them. That's what's going to create a society where they're going to live happier and healthier and more meaningful lives. And so
Yeah.
how can we preserve that in society? And especially when we consider, Jim, there is this large level of immigration. And you know, I'm prepared to agree with you. Immigration is good economically, perhaps not for a welfare state, but in terms of the temperament, I have a great fear for the future of the West. What can we do on an individual level to maintain levels of C?
Look, the first thing, getting back to that, I can understand the attitude of people like UKIP who want to sort of slow down or stop immigration because they fear being overrun. But the problem isn't really the immigration, it's our own weaknesses. So we need to restore that former temperament, the higher C, the moderately high V temperament that made us great. I mean, we have been a great people. We had tremendous success. Well, there's basically two ways to achieve that. The first one, obviously, is to restore in some way traditional values, traditional Christian values, which means chastity, which means discipline of children, particularly control of children more than punishment. We've got to try and restore the temperament that we have had in the past. Now, the problem with that is it's very, very, very difficult. Because with the wealth of society and with the collapsing level of V, it's extraordinarily difficult to go against the trend. And I'm like you. I try and help my children to have old-fashioned values. But it's very hard to do that because the society around them is changing in the opposite direction. So
Yes.
traditional Christianity, traditional Christian values, or Jewish values for that matter, or Buddhist values for that matter, but traditional disciplined values is a way to do it, but we need help at the biochemical level and use that to support these traditional behaviors. And that's what my research team is actually doing. One of the things we're doing is trying to work out understanding the biochemistry. And for example, in rats, we've actually managed to reverse this thing quite dramatically by using pheromones.
That's
So
fascinating.
theoretically, it's quite possible to do it through a combination of traditional values supported by the chemistry that kind of immunizes against the effect of affluence, of too much wealth. So there is a possibility, if we do the science and if we apply it, if we want to apply it, we could actually turn this thing around. It's not too late. In a few decades' time, it probably will be. Right now, it could be changed. And I'm actually about to launch an institute called the Institute for Social Neuroscience, which is going to be teaching psychology, but it's actually a research institute also dedicated to finding out how to come to grips with this thing. And I might say the initial application is not so much how to change the civilization, it's a way of treating things like drug addiction and alcoholism and poor maternal behavior and those kinds of social problems. In other words, it's a clinical thing.
Well, really, I think that's where we all have to start, isn't it? You've described in your book trying to raise C is a bit like some men trying to push a huge boulder up a hill, and prosperity, having too much in this society which leads us to have these addictive behaviours toward pleasure, really, primarily, is like another man coming down the hill and pushing down against that boulder. So I think really that is the place to start for all of us, really.
Science is the only answer. Science combined with traditional values theoretically could change it. Now, it might be too late for many people, but even if 5% of the population could actually change themselves in a way, they would eventually become more and more successful. And the people who chose to do this would do so much better. They'd be the leaders of society. They'd be the industrial leaders. They'd be the business founders. They'd be the people who'd be successful in all spheres of life. And eventually, I think it could work. And that's my life's mission, to see if that's possible. I don't know if it is. I hope it is not too late.
In my mind, I think if there was some way of developing some sort of supplement, and you've already said you're researching towards developing something which will enable us to change the chemistry in our bodies so that we would be a higher C, have that sort of temperament on an individual level. But we are social animals, and in terms of the groups we form, how can we develop groups where we are encouraging each other to develop more forms of behaviour that would increase that C characteristic, because we've got to be realistic about the world we're living in, and many people are just not convinced, they're not interested in religion at the moment. Would it be possible then for us to develop just groups in our local communities whereby we are encouraging each other in behaviours that would develop a higher C with a mutual hope for bettering our society for the future?
Yes, it certainly would be, even on a secular level, if people get together and encourage each other to look after their children properly, to control them in reasonable ways, to restrain their appetites. That would be helpful. I don't think you'd find anything more powerful and effective than traditional Christianity or religious system.
Yeah.
There's a lot of power to that. I mean, I'm a Christian myself, and knowing that this is God's path for my life is a very powerful help to me, in prayer and scripture study and those kinds of things. So it's very difficult to do it without religion of some kind, and a fairly traditional religion too. A lot of modern Christianity is very namby-pamby. They've knocked out a lot of things. A lot of the powerful, what we call C-promoting traditions have been dropped from modern religion. And then religion becomes very feeble. You really need a more fundamentalist kind of religion that basically says, let's stick to the whole message of the Bible. But look, anything is helpful. Anything you can do in your own life. Eating more moderately, being more disciplined, getting up at a reasonable hour, trying to have a regular life where you take a day, a week off. Anything that you can do will help to preserve your C, and it will help your children to have a better chance in life. And also to be less likely to get into things like drugs and alcoholism and depression and those kinds of ills.
Just a couple of final questions I wanted to ask you, really. As someone married to a Turkish wife, I can sort of sympathise with you being married to a Chinese lady, in that the family on the other side, when they hear or see me, I was with them on holiday recently, and when I try to be much more controlling of my daughter, who is 3, there is this resentment. I can feel it, I can see it. They don't think that that's appropriate. They don't think that my daughter really understands what I'm trying to do. What advice as a father could you give me?
Look, I have to be honest. I don't even try with my younger children, with my Chinese wife. And they're beautiful kids. They really are. It's having a high C is what counts. Really it is. I mean, Jewish people, for example, are relatively high S, but they're also probably the most brilliant and creative people in all of human history, with the possible exception of ancient Greeks of a certain period.
Yes.
So I don't think having high S is really the issue. The thing is, we've got to have high C. And that's what we've got to do, make sure that they do. So if you can start controlling your children earlier, that's probably, I would say, a good thing overall. But the main thing is that you have this sense of discipline in the way you treat them, and also to encourage them to have the values where they'll exercise discipline in their own lives. One of the most important things you can do for your children too is to try and discourage them from being sexually active at a young age, because sexual activity in adolescence is one of the worst things that can happen. And this is something that came up, as you can see it in the Kinsey report. Now, Kinsey wrote these books, which are basically diatribes for sexual liberation, but his own statistics actually show that one of the best indicators of success in later life is limited sexual activity in adolescence, particularly early adolescence. So you've got to try and protect your children from this. And there are groups like the Mormons, for example, who are very, very good at these areas, and that's why they're very successful.
Yes,
why
that's right.
As a church, they're growing, and they're known for being successful in business, in political terms. They're just extraordinarily effective because they've got this great cultural technology.
Right.
And I don't happen to believe in the Mormon beliefs, but as a form of behavior, they are extraordinarily, we call it a cultural technology. It's a technology that creates high C, and they're very good at it. Traditional Christianity, very good at it. Modern Christianity, not very good.
My final question, where do you think the next big peak of C is going to happen in the world?
Well, if we manage to turn this thing around and work out a way to do it, you might well find that a country like Russia, for example, would adopt it because they're much more concerned about decline. If I was going to look at a country to become a world leader, I'd probably say Russia, because if they get the idea of this technology and they work out that it works, and they're an advanced scientific country and they start applying it, they could become the world dominant power. Now,
very interesting.
If our civilization collapses, Russians, by the way, have got relatively high V still. That's why they're being sort of so aggressive about Ukraine and so forth. But if civilization collapses, there's only one area left, and that's sub-Saharan Africa, because they're a very low S people, and they're being introduced to these very advanced cultural technologies like Christianity and to some extent Islam. If they can, and this would take centuries, if they could combine this, if they could adopt them wholeheartedly and raise the level of C, they could actually become the dominant world power in a few hundred years' time by having very, very high C.
Very interesting, yeah.
Not the countries you'd think of, would you? But that'd be my prediction.
No, not immediately. It wasn't what I was expecting you to say. But it's fascinating, yeah.
But I mean, who would have thought that Europe would dominate the world? You go back to the ancient times, even the 1000 BC, for example. Who would have thought that Northern Europeans would dominate the world? These barbarians, these savages, and you get these vast prosperous Muslim empires. China is incredibly powerful. And then these disease-ridden barbarians up in the north. Who would have thought? Even like 1400, who would have dreamed it? It's because you have this very primitive, low S temperament, which had been introduced to these Christian ideas, which had the potential to raise C, that eventually we came to basically dominate the world.
Well, thank you very much for that. And like I said before, the theory seems to fit almost too well with the historical facts. I think you brought that out wonderfully in your book. And everyone who hears this message, I implore you, the first thing you must do is go and buy a copy of this book, read it. I'm not insisting you have to agree with it, but at least you've got to handle the information. That's what the peer reviews for the book say. It demands to be given some consideration. And that's what I hope for the future, Jim, and I wish you all the best in the work. I think it's hugely important, and I can't thank you enough for your time, and it's been an honour and a pleasure, and very educational.
Well, thank you, Rick. I really appreciate your support. Actually, our website, biohistory.org, has some very useful videos which explains the outlines, but really good to read the book, absolutely.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that third video coming out. They're concise and very well done.
Yes, I actually saw an earlier version. It's good. Probably in a few more weeks.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jim.
Thank you.